all mud peat we done there.
Upon us from now and building up the children will be a
Must be my husband.
Everything about The Gilded Age Season 4 feels different this time, not because the show has changed its formula, but because the stakes around every single character now feel heavier, sharper, and far more personal than anything we've seen before. There's this growing sense that we are not just heading into another season of social battles and quiet power struggles, but into a point where choices actually start leaving permanent scars. And if you've been paying attention to how Season 3 ended, then you already know nothing was truly resolved. It was paused, suspended, left hanging in a way that almost feels intentional. Because now, the real question is not what happens next, it's how much damage has already been done off-screen while everyone is waiting for answers that may never come cleanly. And that is exactly where Season 4 begins to feel dangerous in the best possible way. Because the silence between seasons is never empty in a show like this. It's pressure building. It's consequences forming. It's characters sitting in decisions they can't undo. And when you look at Bertha Russell, George Russell, and everything surrounding them, it becomes very clear that we are heading into a season where emotional control might finally start breaking down. Not in loud, dramatic explosions, but in slow cracks that spread too far to repair. Now, when we talk about Bertha Russell going into Season 4, we are not talking about the same woman we met at the start of this journey. That version of her was calculated, ambitious, and always 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. But Season 3 changed something in her, even if she refused to admit it openly. The victory she fought for came at a cost, and the losses she buried did not disappear. They stayed, they accumulated, and they are now sitting right under the surface of everything she does. That is what makes her so unpredictable going forward. Because Bertha doesn't break in obvious ways. She doesn't fall apart. She adapts. She recalculates. She tightens her grip even harder, until eventually, there is nothing left to hold on to without feeling the pressure. And that is why this season is being described, even unofficially, as her breaking point. Not because she will suddenly lose control, but because the world around her is no longer as flexible as it used to be. The social battlefield she once dominated is shifting. The rules are not as forgiving. And the consequences of her past decisions are no longer distant possibilities, they are becoming immediate realities she has to face head-on. Every alliance she built, every boundary she crossed, every sacrifice she justified in the name of progress, all of it is now converging into a moment where she can no longer simply move forward without looking back. And then there is George Russell, whose storyline carries a completely different kind of weight. One that is quieter, but arguably more devastating. Because George has always been the foundation. The stability. The man who holds everything together through force, discipline, and sheer control over his world. But Season 3 introduced something unsettling into that image, vulnerability. Not just physical strain, but emotional cracks that exposed how fragile even the strongest structures can become when they are tested in the wrong way at the wrong time. What makes George's situation so compelling going into Season 4 is not just the question of his health or his position, but the guilt that now sits underneath everything he does. Because once a man like George starts questioning the choices he made for his family, for his legacy, for control itself, there is no easy way back to certainty. And that guilt doesn't just affect him alone. It spreads into every relationship around him, especially Bertha, creating this silent tension that neither of them fully acknowledges but both of them constantly feel. And this is where Season 4 starts to feel like it is building towards something irreversible. Because when you put Bertha's breaking point next to George's internal collapse of certainty, what you get is not just a marriage under pressure, you get a system under strain. A partnership that built an empire together now facing the reality that empires do not survive on strength alone, they survive on alignment. And if that alignment starts to fracture, everything underneath it begins to shift. What makes this even more intense is the fact that neither of them is the type to openly surrender. Bertha fights forward. George holds firm. But Season 4 is shaping up to be the kind of story where forward movement and standing still both start to hurt equally. And that is the real tension nobody can ignore anymore, because the question is no longer whether they love each other or whether they can survive public pressure. The question is whether they can survive each other's evolution. And that is exactly why this season already feels closer than people think. Not because of trailers or announcements, but because the emotional groundwork has already been laid. You can feel it in the way season 3 ended, unfinished, unresolved, and deliberately unstable. It was not an ending. It was a pause before impact. And if section 1 is about the pressure building inside the Russell family, then section 2 is where we start to see what that pressure is actually going to do to everyone around them, because nothing in the Gilded Age ever stays contained for long. Every private tension eventually becomes public consequence, and every silent decision eventually demands to be answered out loud. That's why season 4 doesn't feel like a continuation in the normal sense. It feels like an aftermath that hasn't fully arrived yet. Like we're still waiting for the moment where everything that was set up finally collides at once. Bertha Russell stands at the center of that storm, even when she's not actively trying to control it. And what makes her so dangerous as a character going into this season is not just her ambition, but the fact that she genuinely believes she is still in control of the outcome. Even after everything she has been through, even after the emotional and social costs that piled up in season 3, there is still a part of Bertha that refuses to accept that some situations cannot be shaped by will alone. That belief has always been her greatest strength, but now it is starting to look like her biggest weakness. Because the world around her is no longer reacting the way it used to. The social structure she spent so much time mastering is shifting in subtle but important ways. People are not as predictable. Loyalties are not as stable. And the influence she once wielded so effortlessly is now being tested by newer pressures, quieter resistance, and consequences that don't respond to charm or strategy. Bertha is entering a space where reputation is no longer enough to guarantee control. And that is where her breaking point begins to form, not as a moment, but as a process. And while Bertha is dealing with that slow erosion of control, George Russell is dealing with something even harder to define, because his struggle is not about power in the external world, but about certainty within himself. George has always been written as someone who understands systems, money, structure, and consequence. He doesn't guess. He calculates. But season 3 disrupted that clarity in ways that cannot simply be ignored or reset. The introduction of vulnerability into his life didn't just affect his physical presence, it affected his judgment, his priorities, and most importantly, his sense of responsibility. Now going into season 4, that responsibility has turned into something heavier, something closer to guilt. And guilt, in a character like George, doesn't express itself in emotional breakdowns. It expresses itself in decisions that feel slightly off-center, in moments of hesitation that didn't exist before, in the way he starts to question whether the empire he built actually protected the people he loves or simply controlled them under the illusion of safety. That internal conflict is what makes his storyline so important this season, because it is no longer just about survival or success, it is about meaning. And when you combine George's internal shift with Bertha's increasing refusal to lose control externally, what you get is a relationship that is no longer moving in sync. They are still connected, still bound by history, ambition, and shared identity, but they are no longer standing on the same emotional ground. And that distance, even if it is not fully spoken, is starting to shape every interaction they have. Small conversations begin to carry double meanings. Decisions begin to feel like negotiations. Silence begins to feel heavier than conflict. This is why season 4 feels like it is building towards something that cannot be avoided. Because at some point, emotional distance stops being something you can work around and becomes something you have to confront directly. And in the world of the Gilded Age, confrontation does not come cleanly. It comes through pressure, through reputation, through family, through society, through everything except direct honesty at first. That is what makes it so difficult for these characters to escape what is coming. And while all of this is happening at the center of the Russell world, the ripple effect is already spreading outward. Because when the most powerful couple in the series starts shifting internally, everyone connected to them feels it. Alliances tighten or break. Opportunities appear or vanish. And people who once existed safely in the background suddenly find themselves closer to the center of conflict than they ever intended. That is the real setup of Season 4. Not just what happens to Bertha and George, but what happens to everyone else when the foundation they built their world on starts to quietly shift beneath their feet.